Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating and, honestly, incredibly volatile chapter of American history. If you're studying the development of the New South, getting a handle on late 19th century Kentucky is absolutely essential. We aren't just going to memorize a list of dates and names today. Instead, we're going to look at this entire era as a slow-burning fuse. This was a period marked by systemic failure, extreme economic desperation, and a steady, almost inevitable march toward a total political disaster.
So the fundamental question we really have to grapple with today is this. How exactly does a state's politics turn so incredibly deadly that it literally normalizes political assassinations? I want you to investigate this era with me like a historical crime scene. We have to look past the surface-level events and really analyze the deep structural flaws that made this massive climax of violence entirely inevitable.
Let's start breaking this down with Section 1, the patronage system, focusing on little kingdoms and bosses.
Okay, we need to wrap our heads around this concept of little kingdoms. Back in the late 1800s, Kentucky's state government was notoriously weak. Because of the region's relative geographical isolation, everyday citizens almost never interacted with state authorities. Instead, power was heavily concentrated in the state's 120 counties, and these basically operated as semi-autonomous domains. You didn't answer to some far-off governor in the capital, you answered to the local county judge or the sheriff. And how did those people get elected? Well, through intense kinship ties. Politics here was first and foremost deeply personal. Entire families would vote as solid blocks, and whoever won essentially treated the local government as their own private family business, which, as you can guess, resulted in rampant, unchecked nepotism.
The unwritten rules of this political machine meant that democracy was, quite frankly, up for sale to the highest bidder. In some counties, up to 25% of the vote was just bought on election day, usually for a few bucks or a half pint of bourbon. But the corruption definitely wasn't just a local issue. At the state level, the Louisville and Nashville, or LNN, Railroad acted as this massive, unchecked shadow government. Its CEO, Milton Hannibal Smith, actually viewed legislative bodies as a calamity that simply needed to be controlled. And control them he absolutely did. He bribed lawmakers with free travel passes, lavish entertainment, and huge amounts of campaign funding. The rule of law was actively being subverted by the very people supposed to be writing it.
Moving on to Section 2, Blood and Feuds, Stereotypes, and Violence.
You see, when formal law and order breaks down at the very top, it inevitably bleeds down to the streets. Take a look at the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Frankfort. The official justice system wasn't just corrupt, it was fundamentally broken and brutal. To save a few bucks, the state leased out the penitentiary and its actual inmates to private contractors. These prisoners lived in slime-covered, rat-infested cells. In the 1870s and 80s, diseases like scurvy and pneumonia were just running rampant. To ease this horrific overcrowding, governors like Luke Blackburn started handing out mass pardons. So imagine you're an average citizen, you're looking at a system where the local courts are completely rigged by bosses, and convicted criminals are routinely pardoned and released by the governor.
The natural consequence of this completely broken justice system was absolute chaos. The New York Times definitely did not mince words here. Because citizens felt they couldn't trust the courts to protect them, they turned to vigilantism. Informal mobs that called themselves regulators took the law into their own hands, carrying out beatings and some truly horrific lynchings with absolute impunity. And it's crucial to understand that this is the precise environment that birthed those famous Kentucky feuds, like the Roane County War and the Hatfield-McCoy feud. When the legal system is rotten to the core, a bloody, deeply personal code of revenge simply takes its place.
Now, here is where we need to put on our historian hats and analyze how the rest of the nation digested all this violence. Outside journalists flooded into Appalachia and essentially created two contradictory, deeply reductive stereotypes. On one hand, you had the contemporary ancestor, this romanticized, pure pioneer isolated from the modern world, preserving quaint English customs. On the other hand, you had the violent hillbilly, an ignorant, bloodthirsty savage driven entirely by moonshine and revenge. Both of these caricatures were incredibly damaging because they masked the highly nuanced socio-economic realities of the region. They completely ignored the fact that this violence was very often driven by modern economic rivalries, fierce political partisanship, and massive systemic legal failures, not just some backwoods ignorance.
Next up is Section 3, the Agrarian Revolt, an economic powder keg.
Under intense economic pressure, this whole political landscape really began to fracture.
A severe, long-wave depression was absolutely crushing Kentucky's farmers. Crop prices plummeted, and these farmers were just getting buried in debt. They felt completely ignored by the conservative Bourbon Democrats in power, who heavily favored the railroads and the gold standard. In response to this, massive grassroots organizations like the Grange and the Farmers Alliance rose up, which eventually formed the Populist Party. Their big demand? Free silver, an inflated currency that would make it much easier to pay off their mounting debts. This economic clash created a massive existential rift right down the middle of the dominant Democratic coalition.
And as if an economic depression wasn't enough to make voters absolutely furious, the state was suddenly hit with a breathtaking scandal. In 1888, the highly trusted state treasurer, a guy literally nicknamed Honest Dick Tate, packed up 2 massive sacks of gold and silver coins, along with a huge roll of bills, boarded a train, and was never seen in Kentucky again. It turned out he'd embezzled over $247,000. To put that into perspective, that was roughly 1/10 of the entire annual state budget at the time. The sheer audacious scale of this institutional corruption shattered whatever tiny bit of lingering trust the public still had in their government.
The direct historical consequence of Dick Tate's betrayal, combined with that raging agrarian anger, was the Constitutional Convention of 1890. The delegates who showed up were so profoundly suspicious of government power that they wrote an incredibly restrictive, reactionary constitution. Instead of outlining broad, flexible principles for the future, they handcuffed state officials, strictly limited their salaries, and aggressively regulated corporate monopolies. They basically wrote their deep distrust of politicians directly into the bedrock law of the state. And it's worth noting, this is the very same document that, albeit heavily amended, Kentucky still operates under today.
Which brings us to our final act, Section 4, Political Powder Keg. The system unravels.
The 1890s saw all of these explosive elements, the failed laws, the crushing economic depression, the systemic corruption, finally ignite. In 1895, the Democratic Party fully split over the free silver issue, which allowed Kentucky to elect its first ever Republican governor, William O. Bradley. The political establishment was completely destabilized. By 1897, the system was unraveling so rapidly that citizens were literally blowing up private toll roads with dynamite in what became known as the Tollgate Wars. It proved that vigilante violence was now being actively used as a legitimate political tool for economic relief.
And right into the middle of this chaos steps William Goebel. Goebel was a brilliant, incredibly ambitious Democrat who styled himself as the great champion of the common man against corporate monopolies like the L&N Railroad. But his tactics were utterly ruthless. In 1898, he rammed through an election law that essentially allowed him to stack the state election board completely in his favor. He was polarizing in the absolute extreme. His supporters saw him as a political savior, while his enemies saw him as a tyrant who was entirely willing to destroy democracy just to seize power. The inevitable explosion happened during the 1899 gubernatorial election. Goebel ran against Republican William Taylor in a race that was so incredibly close and so totally rife with fraud that both sides immediately claimed victory. A Republican mountain army actually descended on Frankfort, armed and ready for a physical fight, while the Democrat-controlled legislature prepared to officially hand the election to Goebel. Then, on January 30, 1900, as William Goebel walked toward the state capitol, a shot rang out from a nearby building, striking him down. It was the ultimate, horrifying climax of a political system built entirely on corruption, patronage, and subverted justice. So, as we wrap up this explainer, here is what you really need to take away from this era. Don't just remember the sensational violence or the shocking headlines. I want you to look past those hillbilly stereotypes and consider the historical structure at play here. When a government relies on patronage over professionalism, when the justice system is too weak to actually protect its citizens, and when corporate money subverts democracy, the inevitable result is discord and violence. How did this broken foundation, capped off by the literal assassination of a governor, permanently forge the state's trajectory for the next century? Keep that provocative thought in mind as we continue to study the fascinating, highly complex history of Kentucky. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.